Welcome to UO Today. I'm Steve Shankman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Shredded Coconut. No, we'll talk about that. Otherwise known as Jon Erlandson, recently named a Knight Professor of the Liberal Arts and Sciences and a professor in the Anthropology Department, as well as the Director of the Museum of Natural and Cultural History. He earned his BA, MA, and PhD at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and he came to Oregon in 1990. Jon Erlandson is an archaeologist whose research focuses on maritime societies of the Pacific Coast, the Pacific Rim, and other places in the world. He's the author of more than 100 scholarly articles, the editor or author of 9 books, the co-editor of the Journal of Island and Coastal Archaeology. Thank you very much for being with us. You shouldn't have given me that wicked lead-in, but since I was a bad boy and started it that way, you've gained a lot of worldwide attention. Actually, recently, with the article in Discover magazine in which this name was revealed, Shredded Coconut. You want to just tell us about that?
Not really, but now you brought it up. So they did an interview, an intensive 3-day interview with a really good archaeological journalist, Heather Pringle, who I respect a lot. She came to Eugene and we spent a lot of time talking. She talked a lot about my background, my childhood, and at one point, you know, she put me very at ease. I think it shows what a great journalist she is. And at one point I revealed to her this nickname of Shredded Coconut that I'd been given in 6th grade. And it really had only to do with the fact that my parents moved us back and forth from California into Hawaii. We had just moved back from Hawaii to California, and I'd been, you know, surfing in Hawaii for 2 years, and my hair was bleached almost white. And I think the white hair and the coconut Hawaiian connection, she dubbed me Shredded Coconut.
I see. Did it have a life after that?
No.
Oh, I see.
It died until I brought it up again. But you know, I don't think we ought to take ourselves too seriously, so it didn't really bother me too much that she put it in there. And that everybody at the museum who works for me now calls me Shredded Coconut.
Right. So, and we talked a little bit about this off camera before the interview began. Tell us how you became an archaeologist. I mean, when did the stirrings start happening in you?
You know, all I know is it happened when I was really young. It certainly was in grade school. I was born and raised in Santa Barbara, but my parents both came from Klamath Falls. My grandfather, all my grandparents lived in Klamath Falls, and we used to come up in the summer. And my granddad, A.V. McVeigh, who was an engineer and a professor at OTI at that time, lived right on the lake. And we'd come up in the summer when the lake levels were down, and occasionally one of the kids would find an arrowhead or a spear point or something that had washed up on the beach. And I just vividly remember him. He could pick one up and tell me maybe that one's 8,000 years old and this one's an arrow point that's 1,000 years old. Something about that tangible experience of holding history in your hand and being able to tell stories about ancient peoples always stirred me somehow.
So when you think about the discipline of anthropology today, or I guess archaeology, but anthropology as well, how about your colleagues? Would you say that this is a kind of a common experience? Began when they were young?
I think for many of them it did, yeah. And talking to people over the years, it started really early for a lot of people. On the other hand, we have a lot of students who come here to the University of Oregon and have no idea that they're interested in archaeology or anthropology, and take a class and change their major and decide that's what they want to do with their career.
So tell us a bit now about that article. That apparently you found evidence of, as Coleridge's phrase is, ancient mariners. Have you looked at that poem recently?
I haven't looked at that recently, but it'd be a good one to go back and look at, wouldn't it? You know, as long as I can remember, since I went back to college to study archaeology, I mean, my initial interests were to be one of the Leakeys and go to Africa and study the archaeology of the earliest hominids, but that didn't last very long. That's not really that practical, and there are a lot of really big egos in that area, and I was fortunate enough to meet a few of them and see some of them speak, and I sort of decided that's not really where I want to be.
Mm-hmm.
My second love as a child had always been marine biology, and I'd been fascinated by sharks and marine ecosystems and fishing and surfing and sailing and all those things. And I think when I got to college and I was at Santa Barbara and working with local Indian people and also with professors who were very interested in the history of coastal peoples, I just realized that archaeology and marine biology could be put together into one field, the field of coastal archaeology.
Mm-hmm.
At the time, there was a really interesting theoretical view in anthropology that suggested that humans didn't adapt to oceans or aquatic environments, lakes and rivers, estuaries, until just the last 10,000 years of human history, so the last 99% of human history. And I probably was biased, having grown up by the sea and being interested by the sea, but that always puzzled me.
The last 1% of human history.
The last 1%,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Or less than 1%.
Mm-hmm.
And basically that oceans were insignificant in human history prior to that time. All the books at that time that were written about the history of seafaring and boat technology said boats weren't created, invented, developed until 10,000 to 15,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I always, on some level, felt that couldn't be true. And after my PhD was done, which really studied coastal peoples in California about, from 10,000 years to about 7,500 years ago, I started synthesizing information around the world, and in the last 10 to 20 years there's been a lot of evidence emerge for earlier coastal peoples. And in fact that coastlines and coastal ecosystems were quite important in human history. As far back, it may have gone back 1 million or more years, but certainly by 100 to 150,000 years ago they'd become very important. I started writing about that, and I think in some ways was just really fortunate to be a little bit ahead of some of the discoveries that have come in the last decade that have suggested that boats and seafaring and maritime adaptations actually played a key role in the spread of humans out of Africa, anatomically modern humans, in the last 100,000 years. Mm-hmm. Peopling of Australia was clearly by boat 50,000 years ago. There's evidence that Pleistocene peoples were moving into Western Melanesia, the Ryukyu Islands south of Japan, and maybe even into the New World, the Americas, by boat 15 to 50,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm. So what about, when you talk about Ice Age mariners, what are you referring to?
Well, the Ice Age refers to the Pleistocene, and in this case, mariners, the earliest evidence that we think we have of oceanic crossings, crossing saltwater straits, may be Homo floresiensis. As much as 800,000 years ago, probably a form of Homo erectus in Southeast Asia that moved into the island of Flores, which there's a saltwater gap today of about 20 kilometers that had to be crossed. But after that, there's no evidence that earlier hominids ever made saltwater crossings. Mm-hmm. And until the Pleistocene, the late Pleistocene, when people like us, anatomically modern humans, started to spread around the world.
And that would be how many years ago? 12,000?
I think the earliest evidence is that people probably moved out of Africa about 70 to 75,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. There's genetic evidence and some archaeological evidence emerging that these early coastal peoples in South and East Africa had expanding populations that sort of pushed them out of Africa, and then following the south coast of Asia, eventually came into Southeast Asia, started settling the islands of island Southeast Asia, and then crossed into Australia by at least 50, maybe 60,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. And that really was the first, I think, systematic maritime migration in human history.
So how has the work that you're doing shifted the kind of common perception of when humanoids became mariners or were mariners?
I think it's pushed it back. It's not just my work, but
Mm-hmm.
the work of others as well has pushed it back to at least 50,000 years. And,
Mm-hmm.
and I think more importantly, perhaps, it's started to alter that really deeply embedded anthropological idea that coastlines weren't used by humans until very recently.
Mm-hmm.
There's a number of people along with me who are now arguing that they've probably been important to human history, maybe forever. As
Mm-hmm.
long as there have been hominids, there have
Mm-hmm.
been hominids living in shoreline situations.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure everybody's convinced yet, but in the last 15 years we've had a real impact in changing the views about the role of the sea in human prehistory.
Right, and here's as a young man you grew up in Santa Barbara and in Hawaii by the ocean, and lo and behold, that seems to be where your research has taken you.
That's where I was led, yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What about ocean levels?
Well, that's actually the key to this whole problem, because the reason that anthropologists felt that humans hadn't adapted to oceans and coastlines earlier was that we're living during a period of very high sea level. Now, the last time sea levels were this high was 125 to 130,000 years ago during the last interglacial. And then after that last interglacial, sea levels dropped dramatically, as much as 400 feet below present. And if there were people living along coastlines during that period, they are coastlines that have long been submerged, because sea levels now in the last 20,000 years have risen 400 feet, and they've submerged all those ancient coastlines where the evidence should be. So it's very challenging, actually, to get beyond this anthropological bias.
Right.
And the way that I've done it is to look for proxies, look for other evidence for seafaring or maritime activity that doesn't rely on finding those submerged coastlines. And so looking at islands, where are there islands that have never been connected to a mainland, a continental mainland, and when did they first get settled? And as we now know, there are a number of island groups, including these islands between Asia, Southeast Asia and Australia, that show evidence for occupation 40 to 50,000 years ago. In many cases, there aren't what we call shell middens, the refuse heaps of coastal peoples where they deposit shells and fish bones and things. Those aren't preserved. But the sheer fact that there were humans on those islands 50,000 years ago tells us they had to have boats.
Yeah, otherwise how did they get there?
Yeah.
Especially if they're tiny, I guess, or
That's
smaller.
right.
How about San Miguel? Where does that fit into this?
Well, San Miguel, I've been working there almost continuously for 20 years. It's a small island off the coast of Santa Barbara, maybe my favorite island in the whole world. It first attracted me in part because there's very early evidence for ancestors probably of the Chumash people, who I've worked with for many years, who lived in the Santa Barbara area, colonizing the island at least 10,000 years ago. And along the Pacific coast of North America, those are some of the oldest shell middens and some of the earliest evidence for maritime activity in North America or in the Americas.
Wow.
But in just the last few years, we've also pushed that back. It's back to about 13,000 years now. And we're finding lots and lots of early sites that date between about 13,000 and 9,000 years. And it's really changing our view about what these early peoples did. These are Paleo-Indian peoples. Essentially, by the time Clovis peoples, these supposed interior big game hunters, were widespread in North America, there were already people on the Channel Islands collecting shellfish, fishing, hunting sea mammals, seals and sea lions and things like that.
What about migrations? How does that work into this picture?
I guess that's one of my big interests in the last few years. I've written several articles, and the Discover magazine piece featured this part of my research, was trying to track various migrations in recent human history, as in the last 150,000 years. And it used to be thought that those migrations were predominantly by land. By terrestrial peoples, and I started wondering if people could spread out of Africa throughout Eurasia and into the New World, how did they do it? If they had to cross rivers.
Yeah.
They had to, in some places, probably cross estuaries, and they couldn't have been swimming all of these gaps. There's women and children and old people and young. And that stimulated me to look into, the potential for boat crossings in a broader worldwide perspective.
And why did people move around in those days?
I think, one of the things that a lot of people ask me about the peopling of the Americas and the coastal migration theory, if it happened that people came by boat around the North Pacific, around the Pacific Rim, did it happen really fast? And in some geological sense, it probably was fast, but in a human sense, it was quite slow, probably. I think moving out of Northeast Asia or maybe a migration originating in Japan, going around the Pacific Rim, eventually reaching the southernmost parts of South America. This is a migration that probably took 5,000 years. And if you divide up the length of that migration by 5,000 years, it doesn't take, it really is a gradual step-by-step migration. There probably were, you know, really adventuresome people who were forging ahead into unoccupied territories, but they always had to maintain the connection to the people they left behind. You have to have marriage partners. You have to have interaction with your own kind. So they weren't just speeding down the coast. I think it was a gradual settlement. And I suspect that as they were moving down the coast, they were also moving up major rivers like the Columbia, which have enormously rich salmon resources. And ultimately, those little diversions off the coastal migration, or what I've called the Kelp Highway, may have led to the colonization of interior regions as well. Maybe the early occupations at Paisley Cave in Central Oregon.
What are the genetic markers, if any, that connect Asia to the Americas or to North America?
There's a whole host of them, and it actually, genetic data, and in particular ancient DNA and modern DNA studies, both mitochondrial DNA, which tracks maternal lineages, and Y chromosome DNA, that tracks paternal lineages.
How do you find this stuff?
A lot of it comes right out of the tissues of modern people. You know, cheek swab samples, and they're analyzing diversity in modern populations and then measuring the diversity in various parts of the world, and then they can project mathematically back in time when the different lineages diverged. And so there's some genetic data that suggests that people first came into the Americas maybe 25 or 30,000 years ago.
So you can actually take a tissue and you can date it back,
well,
some of the genetic material to 25 or 30,000 years, and it's fairly reliable?
By studying the diversity inherent in modern populations and the variation between different ethnic groups today.
I see.
Yeah, they can reconstruct lineages that go back tens of thousands of years. Now, they also, under the right circumstances, have been able to extract ancient DNA, as they did at Paisley Caves with these human coprolites, the desiccated feces that are 14,000 years old. They were able to extract human DNA from those. You can extract human DNA from bone if it's well preserved. And so a lot of those lineages, the genetic lineages, are built on the DNA of modern people, but there are key connections with ancient DNA samples that have been extracted as well.
So you can actually take some of this stuff, the ancient stuff, and look at the DNA.
I can't, but there are people who do.
People who can do that.
They've extracted Neanderthal DNA. That was revolutionary, you know, and showed pretty emphatically that Neanderthals were very different from modern humans. So that many people who used to call Neanderthals Homo sapiens neanderthalensis now call them Homo neanderthalensis and say they're a separate species.
Right. So Native Americans, you mentioned that you've been working with Native peoples for quite a while. What do we learn from the genetic heritage of Native Americans?
I think it depends on who you talk to and which study you look at. And I think to understand that, the study of DNA and reconstructing lineages directly from DNA sequences is still a pretty young science. And there are both maternal and paternal lineages that have been studied, and they haven't always told the same story. Now, it could be because men in the past were doing different things than women. But I think in part, the chronology of the movement of people out of Northeast Asia into the New World, and the connections are very strong, that Native Americans originally came from Northeast Asia. The chronology is a little bit, it's fuzzy, and it's partly because we're not quite sure where the divergence of the lineages happened. You can project back from the DNA and say Native Americans diverged from Northeast Asians 30,000 years ago, but you don't know whether that happened in Siberia, in Beringia, now submerged subcontinent, or in the New World. So you're not quite sure when people first got into the Americas from the DNA data alone. That's where you have to combine DNA evidence with archaeological evidence to sort of put dots on the map as well as points in time.
Is this something that your own research is concerned with?
To some extent. That certainly played a role in the recent papers that I've written about human migrations, because there is a substantial amount of genetic information that's coming out of existing populations in southern Asia that suggests that there are African-like populations that are still remnant in that area, and that their genetics are very similar to, say, the San Bushman people in South Africa. Yeah. In the New World, in the Americas, there's also some recent studies that suggest that there's a lot of genetic similarities among modern Native American peoples living along the Pacific coast, all the way from Alaska to South America. And it's been used to support the coastal migration theory.
Now, if we just kind of step back a bit now and just reflect on the significance of what you've been talking about and the work you've been doing for the world we live in today. How do the kind of things you're doing, tell us how the importance of it for how we live our lives today and as we move into the 21st century?
Well, you know, on one level, I think just understanding our history, the human species, who we are, where we came from, helps us say something about what we are today and where we're going. And I think intellectually that alone is enough to justify the work. But to give you maybe a more practical example, I've been working extensively with a lot of marine biologists and marine ecologists on issues related to fisheries and human impacts on fisheries and the collapse of marine ecosystems and fisheries around the world. And one of the things that this new model of early human fishing contributes to those syntheses is that in fact humans have been impacting, affecting, and influencing marine ecosystems and fisheries for much longer than we used to think. If people only started systematically and intensively fishing 5,000 or 10,000 years ago, then we shouldn't expect a lot of ancient impacts on marine ecosystems. On San Miguel Island, I've worked with a group of marine ecologists for about 8 years now, and we think that we have pretty definitive evidence that Native American peoples, the ancestors of the Chumash, had significantly altered the nearshore marine ecosystem by hunting otters, sea otters, not eradicating them, but depleting them, and they're a keystone predator that controls a lot of productive fisheries, abalones and urchins and other things. And if you remove them from the ecosystem, it fundamentally changes kelp forest ecosystems and other nearshore intertidal ecosystems. So the idea that people in fact have been living actively in coastal areas and fishing, exploiting marine fisheries suggests that many of the things that we're now trying to restore degraded fisheries or ecosystems towards are actually not wilderness pristine states. They're anthropogenic states that were already created and changed by native peoples.
Right. But let me just ask you this, and I may be wrong about this, but the population of the world now is so huge, I mean the human population, that one just gets the sense that whatever changes humans made before seem to be quaint and sort of minor with the kinds of changes that can be affected by humans now with technology in the 21st century. Do you sense that? When you look at your work and you go back over tens and tens of thousands of years, the slowness of time in the past and what we're faced with now, how about that in terms of your own sense of time and sort of the urgency of the present moment in terms of dealing with the planet that we are living on?
Yeah, I mean the problems that we've created in marine fisheries and marine ecosystems today and throughout the earth and global warming, these are just immense problems that humans have never faced before. They're on a scale that these ancient societies never faced. But at the same time, if you're to take just say San Miguel Island or the California Channel Islands and think of them as sort of a world in a microcosm, they are in a way a case study or a model of people who lived in a single ecosystem for 10,000 or more years, probably 15,000 years. And they clearly had fairly substantial impacts on their environments. and yet they managed to sustain those fisheries and relatively high populations and regional exchange networks, monetary systems, shell beads and things, over very long spans of time. We can see points in that 10 to 15,000 year trajectory where they had a pretty tough time, and they probably brought their problems on themselves. And then later we find that they've made adjustments. And if we can look at those more ancient societies, those more ancient case studies as the world in a microcosm, and learn something from how humans challenged their environments in the olden days and yet recovered, and maybe learned conservation principles and other ways of interacting with nature, we can learn something from them that might be really helpful for us.
So in the minute and a half that we have left, where do you see your work going over the next several years, your research?
I still have a lot to do in the Channel Islands, on the California Channel Islands, and every time I go to San Miguel, or I've just come back from Santa Rosa Island, I'm just amazed. I find something that amazes me. And a week ago, once again, after 25 years of archaeological research on the islands, we found a site that just amazes me, something I never would have expected. And so as long as it remains fresh for me, and as long as it remains interesting, and we're making new discoveries, and we're building an enormous library of really valuable data to study what we call the historical ecology of the island, and it has practical applications, I'll keep going back there. It's a very, for me, it's a very restorative experience, because those islands were really, really degraded by historic overgrazing, the ranching period. And those sheep and pigs and cattle have been removed, and the islands are restoring themselves. And so it's very inspirational for me to go back year after year and see nature heal itself. We can do it.
Well, on that inspiring conclusion, I'll thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure.
We've been speaking with Jon Erlandson, Knight Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Oregon Museum of Natural and Cultural History. Thank you for watching.